All right, guys, now we have gone through all of Genesis. We're now at the end of Genesis. I want to talk about the life of Joseph. This will take us from Genesis 37 to 50. What we've seen so far through Genesis is the creation, the fall of man, the sin of man, the flood. Then we go to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and now we're at Joseph. And this actually gets us to, I want us to remember who God is talking to through Moses, the people of Israel that have come out of Egypt, remember, and they are into the wilderness going into the promised land. That's when Genesis was written. So he's actually telling Israel about their history, right, and who God is. So now we see how they actually ended up in Egypt, which is God used Joseph to do that. So I want us to look at Joseph's life, and I want us to see three things here. One, we're going to outline Joseph's life and the things that have happened to him real quick. And then I want us to see how God is in control of absolutely everything. Now, even when we don't see him, maybe when we don't hear him, he's actually in control of everything. Also, I want us to see Christ through Joseph's life. I told y'all before that from Genesis 1:1 to Revelation 22, the last verse in 22, you see Christ throughout all of Scripture. This is no exception. We'll actually see just a glimpse of the redemptive plan that God has through Christ. We can see that through Joseph. Not only that, but through the flood. That I don't know if I covered or not when we were over there. So we'll kind of talk about that a little bit. So first off, I want to get us to Joseph's life. Joseph is one of Jacob's 12 sons. Okay, now we see the 12 tribes of Israel, which we're going to do a video about as well. But Joseph was, at this time, when in Genesis 37, he was 17 years old. He had a couple of dreams that his family didn't like very much. Okay, God gave him some dreams. One of them was that he would have dominion over his brothers throughout the dream, as far as the way it was interpreted, and then that they would all, including Jacob, bow to him. His brothers didn't like that very much, but a lot of people think that Joseph was like a cocky kid or arrogant in this, and I don't think he was. The Bible doesn't really portray that at all. It just says he had dreams, and him being young told his older brothers about him. He told it. They took him to his parents, and the way that it was interpreted was, you're saying that we're going to bow down to you, that you're gonna have dominion over us. You're our little brother. So that did not go over too well. Even Jacob was like, "Hey, relax a little bit." You know what I mean? With these dreams. So nobody really knew the plan or what was ultimately going to happen, but God is telling Joseph and them all that what's about to happen and what's going to happen. So how that plan was going to get fulfilled, it just seems so far-fetched, right? And I think that happens with us a lot. I mean, when God kind of gives us a calling, we just seems like it's so far-fetched of what's going to happen, but we never know how God is going to get us there. We think that our calling and what we're about to go and do is going to be an easy path, but as we can see with Joseph, it wasn't very easy, okay? Now, I want us to see Joseph actually was, and I'm just going to kind of outline his life real quick for you in case y'all don't know the story of Joseph, but he was going to be killed by his brothers after these dreams. They said, you know what, we don't want anything to do with you. They were going to kill him. Reuben, the oldest, the firstborn of Jacob, actually felt kind of sorry for Joseph and said, God his brothers not to kill him, but they threw him in a well, which Reuben was going to go back and get him later on, but before he could, they actually sold him to Ishmaelites. And so this kid that had this dream that God was going to do some amazing things in his life, he just got thrown in a well, sold into slavery, or sold into slavery to the Ishmaelites by his brothers. Could you imagine at all what's going on in his head? Like, seriously? I mean, what's happening here? What's going on? God's plan would develop and unfold over 13 years of pretty much hell on earth for this guy. Okay? So he was sold to the Ishmaelites, and then they took him to Egypt, and they sold him as a slave in Egypt. He became a slave to Potiphar, which is one of the the captains of the guards. He was sold to Potiphar as a slave. God blessed him and blessed Potiphar's house. So Potiphar let him reign in his house as far as put him in charge of everything. But I want us to see, and we'll go over this a little bit of God's control. But as things were going well, Joseph probably was like, "Well, this is pretty cool. I got sitting here. It was kind of rough, and now I'm in charge of this guy's house." But then his wife turns and falsely accuses him of trying to attack her physically, sexually, and then Potiphar had to throw him in prison, right? So now Joseph, you can imagine what's going into his mind. I mean, he had it pretty good here. Now he's thrown into prison. But I want us to look a little bit when you read through this, and I encourage you guys to read from 37 to 50. Actually, all of Genesis. It's pretty amazing. I mean, just look at how God, from creation to this time, is pretty neat. But Potiphar actually, I think, believed him. But because of who Potiphar was and saving face, he put him in prison. But you'll see that it was actually Potiphar was in charge of the prison, which then put Joseph in charge of the prison. So I think he knew that this man of God didn't do what his wife said he did. That's why he put him in his prison and put him in charge of that prison. And then everything started going well in the prison. I mean, the prison started to prosper. So we see that when Joseph puts his hands on, things are doing good, but he's still in prison. He's still in prison, right? So just to kind of get through his outline, some prisoners came. The cupbearer came, and the chief chef came to prison. Obviously, they did something to Pharaoh. These were guys that were right next to Pharaoh. Came to prison, had a couple of dreams. Joseph interpreted their dreams. One of them would be hanged, and that happened a few days later. The other one would get out of prison and go back to being a cupbearer for Pharaoh. So as they saw that his interpretation was correct, the cupbearer was coming out and going back to Pharaoh. He said, "Hey, don't forget me when you go out. Try to get me out of here, out of the prison." Well, guess what? He forgot. He forgot about him, and he spent 2 more years in prison. Now, this is over a 13-year span we're talking about here, guys. So after he did this for the cupbearer, he showed him who he was. He spent 2 more years there, and then Pharaoh had a dream, and that no one could help him, no one could interpret it or anything. So then that cupbearer came to mind and said, "Hey, there's a guy in prison right now. His name is Joseph. He can interpret dreams." So they get him out, they come out, and then, of course, he interprets his dream and finds favor with Pharaoh, just like he did with Potiphar. Now he found favor with Pharaoh. And then he becomes the right hand to Pharaoh. So he gets put in charge of everything of Egypt. Egypt prospers, and the dream is that they will have a huge blessing over the next 7 years, and then they will face famine for the next 7. So Pharaoh puts Joseph in charge of accumulating everything during the prosperous 7 years, and then so that they can survive the 7 years of famine. Not only do they survive the 7 years of famine, but Egypt gets a hold of everything during that time, and Egypt becomes a pretty mighty place. So Egypt prospers because Egypt has all this abundance of everything, because Joseph took care of prospering Egypt during that time of abundance. Then the famine came, but it came all over the place, pretty much worldwide famine, that people were coming to Egypt to get food. So they would need to not only buy the food, but eventually their money ran out. Okay, during the 7 years of famine. And this is important, what we're going to talk about a little bit later, but their money ran out. They had to sell their livestock, they sold their land, they sold their kids, they became slaves. They had to do whatever they had to do to get food from Egypt. So Egypt accumulated tons of land, people, livestock, everything during the 7 years of famine. But during this time, his brothers ended up coming to Egypt to try to buy food. They didn't recognize who Joseph was. Obviously, they didn't think he was running all of Egypt. But they didn't recognize him at first. He did recognize them. Joseph recognized his brothers. If you read through it, you'll see that he ended up getting his brother Benjamin there, his little brother, He ended up getting his parents into Egypt. And one of the things that you'll see, and we'll talk about when we talk about the control God has, is that at this time, when his brothers came, we kind of wonder why all these things happened to Joseph. And like I said, we'll talk about that a little bit more. But we see that Joseph wept for his brothers. He forgave them. The bitterness was gone. He loved them. He wanted them all to come to Egypt. There was a way that he made it to where Benjamin would come, and then his parents would come, and they would all be in Egypt together. So they all came to Egypt. Finally, Joseph reveals himself to his brothers. What I want us to see is when Jacob came, he brought all their people to Egypt, right? And you'll have to read through it to get all the little details, but ultimately they end up in Egypt, right? And I want us to see that they actually end up in Egypt with 70 people, right? So remember that God is going to create a people with the land, with the worldwide blessing through the Abrahamic covenant. Here we start seeing that start to unfold and develop. And it starts Israel, Jacob, remember his name was changed to Israel. Israel is now about 70 people that come to Egypt. Now, when they leave Egypt over 400 years later, and we're going to talk about that more in the next videos, but when they leave, it says that they have over 600, I think it's 633,000 in Exodus 12, men of war, like people that can fight. So that's men over age 20, okay? Well, if you look at that, that's usually the men that can go to war, and in that range is usually about a quarter of the population. So God takes Israel from 70 people to 2.4, if you just do the math, so between 2 and 3 million when he actually brings Israel out of Egypt. So we're going to really see God's control and what God is doing when there's silence, when we look at the next couple of videos as far as Egypt coming, or Israel coming out of Egypt. So we see here that it starts with 70 people. Okay, it started with Abraham, then Isaac, and then Jacob, and then you had 12. Now you're coming into 70. Okay, so we see how God starts multiplying his nation, and over the next 400 years, he gets it to between 2 and 3 million as far as people there. We also see through the end of Genesis that Jacob blesses Joseph and his kids. And then we see his prophetic oracle concerning his 12 sons and the 12 tribes of Israel. We're not going to go through all that on this video. I actually have another video I'm going to do about the 12 tribes and how the list changes a little bit and why, and the prophecies that are going to happen with the 12 tribes. That's pretty neat to see what Jacob said, and then kind of see the prophecy unfold as far as how the 12 tribes end up as they grow and go into Israel and go into the promised land and stuff like that. So yeah, we're going to look at that on another video. And then we see that as everyone is in Israel, or in Egypt, Israel is in Egypt, right? Jacob, Israel's in Egypt with 70 people. Then Jacob dies at age 147. And then one thing at the end of Joseph's life, one thing I want us to see real quick is that Joseph understands what God did in his life. I'm sure at the beginning when he's going through all this stuff, he had so many questions, which we're about to talk a little bit more about. But Joseph's understanding of God's will at the end of his life, that's what I wish that we could all kind of unfold and see throughout our life. But I think as we pass certain things in our life, we can look back and see how God really was in control of things. So he says this in Genesis. It says, "But as for you," and this was his brothers. After Jacob died, his brothers were actually worried that Joseph was going to turn, right? Now that Jacob was dead, his dad, now I'm going to take vengeance on my brothers for what they did for me, to him when he was younger. But remember, what God was doing, it really took away all that anger and bitterness. But he says, "As for you," and he's talking to his brothers, "you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, in order to bring it about as it is, to save many people's lives." So he could see how God actually used him through the trials and tribulations and all the things he was going to ultimately save a lot of people. And then it says that Joseph died at 110 years old. That happens in Genesis 50. Before he died, though, he did confirm the Abrahamic covenant, and he tells his brother, "God will bring you out of Egypt and the land he swore to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob." So we see a confirmation with Jacob. We see it with Joseph. We saw it with Isaac. I mean, as far as his promise that God gave Abraham will be fulfilled ultimately. So we also see what's about to happen in Genesis 15. Remember, God told Abraham, your people will be held captive for over 400 years. I mean, that was prophesied already in Genesis 15, which is what we're about to see in the book of Exodus start to happen. So that's kind of a glimpse of Joseph's life, some of the things he went through, the trials, what he became, and how he ultimately was used by God to save a lot of people. So one of the things, the second point, so that was the first thing. I wanted to give a quick outline of Joseph's life. The second thing, I really want to look at how God moved in each of these circumstances. So as you can see my little paper here, I know you can't read it probably, but it says God moved, God moved, God moved, God moved, God moved all over the place. And I want us to see a few little places where God actually moved and where, if we're not looking, we miss it during our life. So first of all, he was, by the time, from 17 years old when this stuff happened to Joseph till he got beside not Potiphar, but Pharaoh, was 13 years. 13 years. We know it was over 2 years he was in prison. He was a slave in prison, one of those things, for 13 years until he got out and found favor with Pharaoh. So 13 years. So I want us to see God's movement in all this. Obviously, God moved in the dreams of Joseph, and he was able to show him what was going to develop over his life. So he gave him a calling. He showed him what was about to happen. God moves in Joseph's brothers because God wasn't going to do this. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that here in a second, but God wasn't going to do this where they were. God needed to move Joseph. Okay, he had to move Joseph. So sometimes that move is not fun, what God is doing with us. He's not always going to move us in a happy place, right? I mean, ultimately we're going to be fulfilled, but that movement can be tough. So that movement, he was in charge. He moved in Joseph's brothers to move Joseph, right? To say, hey, get him out of here. He moved in Reuben to make sure Joseph wasn't killed. Okay? Then before Reuben could go back and get him, he moved in his brothers to sell him to the Ishmaelites. So all these things that look like they're bad things happening, God was moving him to Egypt. How else was he supposed to get to Egypt? That's how he was going to Egypt. God was getting him there. Then we see that as he's moved in Potiphar to buy him, right, as a slave. He moved in Potiphar's wife, right? He moved in Potiphar's house to prosper it, but then he moved in Potiphar's wife because why? Joseph wasn't where he was supposed to be yet, right? Now, you could look at this as Joseph's life and say, man, that had to be rough getting sold by your brothers. Now he's a slave. But you know what? Things are going pretty good. Thanks, God. I appreciate it. Man, this is a blessing. But God says, no. This is not where you're going. This is not where I need you to be. I need you to be next to Pharaoh. So how do we get you next to Pharaoh? Well, now his wife falsely accuses him, and now he's sent to prison because he needs to get him in there with the cupbearers to interpret his dream. Right? So then he gave the cupbearers a dream. Joseph interpreted it, and then they went back to Pharaoh. Now, still, he needed a couple more years of being in prison. The time wasn't right for them to remember Joseph. When the time was right, God put it in their mind to remember Joseph, to tell him to Pharaoh. Now, why didn't all this take place very fast, guys? Why did he have to spend 13 years in prison and doing all this? Well, God is always getting us to a point to be more like Christ. We know that. We know Christ because we know the New Testament, but I'm going to show you Christ through all this. But God's whole motive and plan in our lives is to mentally and spiritually get us close to God. Okay? Now, to spiritually be close to God, you've got to have a loving heart, a forgiving heart, and a peaceful heart. Okay? Do you really think that Joseph, being 17, who knows how old he is at this point, before he spent, 13 years he spent in there, so almost he gets 30 out of there, so he's in his 20s right now. If God got him out of there too early, and then he put him in front of his brothers, do you think there still would have been some anger and bitterness there for his brothers? God had to get all that out of him. He had to get all of it out of him so that when he saw his brothers, we saw that he forgave them and wept for them. Okay, so God is actually moving in Joseph to make him into the man that he needs him to be to actually lead his people. Okay, and we're not, God doesn't snap his fingers in our life and make us this or that. He chips away at us and molds us into the people that he needs us to be. So for Joseph to be a good leader, That stuff had to take place to get his heart right and get his love right for his people. So we see God moves in all those places. So God moves in Potiphar's house. God moves in the prison to make it prosper. And then he moves in Egypt when Pharaoh had his dream. He made Pharaoh had his dream to know. And then he got the cupbearer to say, hey, remember Joseph. So these are all things that God just easily has control over, that we have to remember in our lives, that he's in control of every single thing that's happening, even though we may not see it, we may not hear it. We've got to believe it. We've got to trust it, that he is the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords, and he is going to control everything that's going on to develop and to chip away and to mold you and me as people to do his will in this life. Okay? So he prospers the land. God made the famine happen. God moved in his brothers. He became a great leader, and he grew the nation. Okay, so we can see God moving in every aspect of Joseph's life. Okay, this is an easy application, guys, to see how God is in control and how he's in control of our lives. That sometimes, like I said, we don't know what's going on. We don't know why. We don't see you. We don't hear you. But you've got to trust that God is in control of every single thing, even when we think there may be the worst thing in the world going on. And guys, I'm going to shoot you straight. This happens to me all the time. I'm in sales, right? And I've been very blessed by God, not only in the world standards, but in this country standards. And I could go a few days without selling something, and I start asking questions like, God, I thought you were in control of this stuff. What's going on? And God always takes care of things, but it's so easy to just forget these things that he's done and ultimately what he's doing, that we have to hang tight in there, and instead of getting angry and bitter and questioning him, we've got to get more trusting. And the way that we do that, like I said many a times in my videos, guys, we read his word and we see the outcome of everything and how his plan develops through people, through the world, through his plan, and we can trust it more and more and more, and we can hold to it. And even now, man, I get frustrated sometimes, and then that indwelling love comes over me, and just like, hey, I got you. Don't worry about it. But listen, I'm going to do something in you. You are going to learn to trust me. If I got to put you in in all these circumstances that you don't think are great options for you, and this is him talking to me, I'm going to do that until you become the man that I need you to be. Okay, so that's what he's doing in every single one of us, and we're going to see that big time in the land of Israel, because what we're going to see in the next video is 400 plus years of silence, like of being in Egypt, being slaves, and all this kind of stuff. What's going on? They probably think God just forgot about us. Eventually, they forget about God. And we're going to talk more about that, but let's just focus on this now. So we see God's control and his sovereignty and his power in Joseph's lives, in our lives, in Israel's life. Okay? But I want us to see something, guys. One of the cool things about the Bible, and I've said this before, from Genesis 1:1 to the last verse in Revelation 22, we see Christ all throughout this, okay? I think I kind of forgot to talk about it last time when we talked about the flood, but in the flood, we actually saw the judgment upon sin upon the world, okay, which we will again see another day that's coming. In Revelation, we see the judgment, the wrath of God on the world, upon sin, upon evilness, but we saw that in Genesis. We saw it with the flood, okay? And then we also saw that God's people, his chosen people, were actually put on the ark to be saved through the wrath, okay? So we can actually look at that and say, okay, the redemptive plan of God is to take vengeance upon evil in this world. Remember, that's what we're all looking for. We're all looking for a perfect place. We all blame God for bad things happening. We want his eternal kingdom to come. We just don't realize that there's a process to get there. But we see in the flood that the ark saves God's chosen people to come out of that wrath. So through Christ, we will actually be saved through the wrath, the coming wrath that's coming, okay? Through his blood, through his forgiveness, through his salvation. Well, we can see the same thing here. I want to point out some things. Number one, Joseph saw a vision from God that they would bow down to him, that he would have dominion over them. Well, guess what? Christ was sent by God, and in Romans 14:11 it says, every knee shall bow to me and tongue confess to God. So we see that same thing. Joseph is saying something to his people, and we're looking at Israel, remember? Jacob and Israel, that they will reject him. They will sell him. They will try to kill him. Well, when Christ came, he says, I'm the Son of God. I am God in the flesh, John 1:1, remember? And what does Israel do? Now we're talking about the nation of Israel. Not only the brothers, but the nation of Israel, they reject him. They kill him. Okay, so we kind of see this resemblance there that's happening. Then Joseph suffered in Egypt. Christ suffered and died on the cross. So we see that kind of process happening. Joseph was raised up to the power, the second hand of Pharaoh. We see that Christ, after he was resurrected, is at the right hand of God. Or Joseph was second to Pharaoh, the right hand of Pharaoh. Christ is the right hand of God, and how he comes and takes dominion and all that kind of stuff. Joseph provides food to the world. Now listen to this. This is key, guys. This is key right here. When you read this, you think, man, that's brutal, man. When Joseph had all this prosperity and stuff, he didn't just give it away, guys. Okay, people had to buy it, right? You had to buy it. That's the prosperity of Egypt came about. And then when they ran out of money, they had to give their livestock. And then when they ran out of livestock, they had to give their land. Then when they ran out of land, they had to give their kids. Then they had to give themselves to slavery over to Egypt. They had to buy their land, okay? Now, I want us to put this in the New Testament here, okay? This salvation that God offers, guys, are to those who surrender everything to him, okay? People think that salvation is easy. Right? And ultimately it is. I mean, God sent his son, Jesus Christ, to die for our sins, that all we have to do is believe in him and that he was raised from the dead and confess him with our mouth. That's talked about in Romans. But what does that actually mean? That actually means that we surrender our life to him. We surrender our life to him, our everything. Our everything. It says to love him more than we could even love our kids, our spouses. We love him more than everything in this world. And what that means is when you love Christ and when you love God more than anything in this world, he takes first place in this life. And that's what salvation is. Revelation says, when he's talking to the churches, I'd rather you be hot or cold, lukewarm, I spit you out of my mouth. And I think we think that lukewarm is good, guys. Go to another country. That's here in America. Go to another country where you either deny Christ or you die. That's the choices in a lot of places in this world right now. But in America, it's easy. So we get this lukewarm thing going. And I don't want to condemn anybody or say anything about your life. But I just want to tell you that it's very clear that the Bible says you either are hot or cold. Because if you're lukewarm and you kind of believe in me and you kind of give me your life, I'm going to spit you out. He wants all of our life. Okay? Just like Egypt took all of them to get food, God says if you want the thirst, if you want to be just indwelt with eternity, that's what you need to look at. Don't worry about this life. Trust God with it and give him everything. Everything. Now what does that mean? That means everything. We learn about him, we pray to him, we think about him all day. When he calls us to go do something, we do it. We love him with everything that we are and everything that we do. Okay? Key, guys, the first thing of starting giving everything to God is learn his word and pray to him. He will open up the doors. He will open up the light in your mind and who he is and his calling in your life. But we've got to start in prayer and in his word, and then things just start opening up to what God is going to do in your life, okay? In James 4:14, it says, life is a vapor. Here 1 minute and you're gone the next. We need to understand what this life actually is. It's that. And any minute, any one of us could be gone. It even says, don't think about tomorrow. I mean, you can make plans and stuff, but don't be arrogant about it. It says, pray about it. God, if it's your will, this is what I plan to do tomorrow. Okay? That's the mindset we've got to have. What do you want me to do today? I'm here for you. Let me live today for you. And we do that every single day of our life. Okay? In Philippians 1:21, it says, to live is Christ and to die is gain. That means when you live, you give God glory in your life, and then you anticipate his presence and being with him, because when we die, that's what we anticipate, when we can be in the presence of the most holy God. Okay, so that's important, guys. I think we need to see this. So as we see Joseph's life, we see that he was neglected by his own people. He was sent. He got dominion. People, he became to power in Egypt, but he had to go through struggles and pain and slavery and all the other stuff you have to go through there to get to where he's coming. We see that with Christ, with his life. When he came, he was rejected by his people. He died on the cross. He resurrected. He's with the Father, but he will come again and create his kingdom on earth as it is in heaven, guys. So Joseph offers a new land for his people and forgives them. We see this not only with Christians of all, but also in Israel itself. So we see in Joseph how even though his people neglected him, he forgave them, brought them into the land to live. And we see that in the millennial kingdom, that Christ, even though the Jews rejected him, will actually graft them in, and they will turn to Christ, and he has a kingdom waiting for them, as well as he does Christians as a whole. So through the millennial kingdom, then you get to the new heaven and the new earth, that he has a place in a kingdom that is awesome, that, like I said in the last video, we are just longing for. Even if you don't know it, you're longing for it, because we're longing for it here. Everybody's mad that you have to deal with pain and sin in this world, and why do bad things happen? But what's coming, all that's erased and it's gone, and that's what we're longing for. So if you're longing for that and you don't understand this life, just understand that God has made a way for you through Jesus Christ to hold to our future of what's coming, and to give him every single day of this life. So that's Joseph, guys. Genesis 37 through 50. We can see his life. We can see how God is in control of everything, and you can see the redemptive plan of Christ through it. So through the Old Testament, we start seeing these little things that happen. The flood. Then you have Egypt. We're going to see the deliverance out of Egypt. So you're going to see a whole nother redemptive plan that Christ is showing. So he's showing redemption. This is what's going to happen. And then all of a sudden, after the Old Testament, we see Christ come, the ultimate Redeemer that forgives us of our sins. So hopefully this helped a little bit, guys. Again, next videos, we're going to go into Exodus and all that stuff going on in there. I want to say one thing that we will hit on a lot right now, guys, is when you don't see God all the time, or you don't hear God, you think he's gone. He's never gone. He's always got control of your life. He did in Israel. He did with Joseph as he was going through prison and all the things he did there. But God's ultimate goal and plan in our lives is to chip away the world so that we could be more and more like Christ, and that we could be fulfilled in everything that God has for us here on earth. And we need to trust him every day of our life, even though sometimes we don't know what he's doing. Okay, because that's when he's doing the most. It's when we don't know what he's doing. We don't hear exactly what his plan is. He's doing the most. Okay, and he's getting you ready for his purpose and to fulfill his will. So God bless you guys. Hope you all enjoyed the video. We're going to go into some other things. I'll do some other snap-off videos here, as far as I want to do something about creation, as far as the 12 tribes. But going into our journey through the Bible, this is Genesis, and we're going to get to Exodus. God bless you guys, and I love you all.